Hey guys, my name is Alex, and this is kind of a digressive book review. Over the past few days I've been reading a young adult fantasy novel called INKED by Eric Smith. The beginning of INKED takes place in a village called Frosthaven. When young people in Frosthaven achieve the age of maturity, which I'm assuming is like 16, 17, 18, I'm not sure if it was specifically mentioned in the novel, they have this ceremony of being inked, which is to say being tattooed. What is tattooed on their arms in a kind of magical ink that dances around is an assignment. That assignment is toward the profession in which they will work for the rest of their life. The issue, of course, is that a lot of kids end up being sort of condemned to these lines of work for which they have neither any aptitude nor passion, and they're just sort of condemned to languish in these jobs for the rest of their life. So our hero, Kanem, is coming up on his day of inking, and he decides he really doesn't want to do it, and coincidentally, the town gets pillaged just at the time that he was supposed to be inked. A lot of stuff happens, and it kind of ends up turning into your conventional story of three young people on a quest. Anyway, what I really wanted to talk about is the fact that, as I mentioned before, this is a young adult fantasy novel. Two genres that I tend to avoid. The reason I tend to avoid fantasy, frankly, is like this anxiety that I'm not going to be able to sort of juggle and grasp the mechanics and the politics of this made-up world in the course of a few hundred pages. An anxiety that I think is very fairly grounded in my grievous ineptitude to grasp these things in like the world that I live in. I was surprised though and delighted to find that with INKED I could pretty much follow the whole thing. There were a few instances where I would get confused with the names of some peripheral characters because they're all names from like some foreign tongue that I've never heard before. And here and there I would get kind of disoriented as to our location, whether we were in the woods or where were these characters going, where were they coming from. I do think, however, that that wasn't really so much the author's fault so much as it is having to do with my just general inexperience with the genre. My segue into the reason why I don't read very much YA, though, has to do with two particular grievances that I had with this book. One of those grievances had to do with sexuality, and the other one had to do with violence. Mainly having to do with the lack of both of those things. First, let's talk about the sexuality part. We've got these two leading characters, Kanem and Drea, who clearly are madly in love with one another. And yet, despite all of the passion and like the genuine love that they honestly feel for one another, all they do is exchange these very chaste glances at one another. You get these scenes where they're playing in the grass and they roll over one another and there's like all this sexual tension and the narrator is talking about the warmth of her touch and how it lingers on his body. What bothered me is like, I recently worked for 2 years as a high school substitute teacher and I'm currently going into my third year working at a junior college. I couldn't help but think, given what I've seen in the hallways of the places where I work, that if ever there really were two teenagers who are as crazy about one another as Drea and Kanem are, and if ever those two teenagers were afforded the amount of privacy that these two characters are afforded in the course of the novel, those teenagers would be all over each other. The second issue, as I mentioned, had to do with the violence. There's a lot of action in this book. There's tons of fist fighting, there's some sword play, there's a lot of like clashing of magic. There's a scene where you see some guy get his hand chopped off. Then there's another scene where our characters stumble upon these two bodies in a greenhouse where you can tell by the wounds inflicted that they must have been tortured before they were killed. So the violence isn't really taken lightly, but it also isn't sort of depicted with the gravity that I think, I don't know, honest depictions of violence kind of deserve. Young adult novels are targeted at a younger audience than myself. Obviously, there are some strictures of censorship there. Now, when I say that I was looking for something a little bit more in the department of sexuality, I wasn't looking for like some graphic, crazy Henry Miller sex scene, but something, I don't know, something a little more believable than for these two horny, hormonal teenagers to just glance at each other suggestively when they've got this whole empty forest in which to sort of copulate. And then also, here I am looking at this book which is targeted toward like 14, 15, 16-year-olds and kind of being pissed that their depictions of battle aren't these gruesome Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian parades of gore and psychosis. I was thinking that me at 25 being upset with a young adult novel for not being more R-rated in its subject matter is kind of like going into Home Depot and like bitching about the fact that they don't sell bananas. I'm looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place. Anyway, so while I'm not of the camp that sort of offhandedly dismisses YA as being like this bullshit genre with zero redemptive literary merit and that is just sort of like corroding the minds of young people, I do at the same time feel kind of villainous for the way that I just kind of want to blanketly say that this genre might not be for me. Again though, I did enjoy this book. I do think it's well written, it was propulsive, it was engaging, it kept me hooked for, the very brief 3.5 hours it took to read. I read a great deal of young adult when I was in middle school and I always found it gripping and I was always sort of sated with their depictions of violence or sexuality. Now, for some reason, it just doesn't hit the mark. So I'm wondering, is it just kind of a fair assessment for me to say that, given the inherent strictures of content in a young adult novel, it'll never really live up to my expectations about, like, how a theme should be explored? But I see sort of the aggression and the urgency with which champions of young adult fiction sort of defend it from its naysayers and its haters. It compels me to think that there's something, like, wrong or biased or discriminatory about me, just for the fact that I kind of don't like this genre, mainly because I feel like I am just being sort of all-encompassing and dismissing a whole series of books based on some impressions that I've gotten from a few of those books in my 20s. Anyways, this is something that I would really like to discuss with the author of this book and its upcoming sequel, Branded, which is coming out in September. Eric Smith is like this super friendly, very available internet presence. I've reached out to him once, but I know he's got another job aside from writing, so I think that with a little push from you guys, I might be able to get his attention, might be able together to sway him into sort of exchanging some emails that I might be able to put together into an interview format for my website, View from the Bar, which there's always a link to it in the description of the video. So you would be doing me a huge solid if you would shoot a tweet over to Eric Smith at EricSmithRocks on Twitter. I'll put his Twitter handle down in the description. Let me know if you love YA, if you hate YA, are there some things that the genre just can't provide? Once again, constant reader, thanks for watching.